Lesson 0, General Class Tips. I'm including this section because there are just a couple of general tips I want to give you that will apply to every lesson of the class, and they'll hopefully improve your scores on checkpoints and workbooks just by following a few key guidelines. So first, rounding. When you're working on a problem, especially a multi-step problem, make sure you do not round your answer until the end of the problem. So for example, let's say we have a problem that has 5 steps to it, and at every step you're making some sort of computation. Maybe on step 2 you get some answer that has quite a few decimal points behind it. You might be tempted to cut this answer, for example 2.234567, You might be tempted on step 3 to just use this number and write 2.2. Don't do that. Use the complete number, or at least I would say 5 or 6 decimal points when you're computing until you get to that final step, and once you reach your answer, you'll round according to how the question has asked you to round. Let me give you an example of how this affects your final answer. So say the question has asked you to find 3% of 13% of 2.9, and it's asked you to round to the nearest thousandth. So here's what you would do. You would just find 13% of 2.9, and you find that it's 0.377. Your next step, you need to find 3% of 0.377, so you find 3% of 0.377, and you find that it is 0.01131. Now, it has asked you to round to the nearest thousandth, so your final answer would be, you would round to the nearest thousandth, your answer would be 0.011. So there's your answer. Notice that we got this calculation in the first step that had 3 decimal points, and we didn't round it, we left it as it was, and we continued our calculation. Now your answer might have come out differently had you rounded that number, for example. Let's do the same thing but with rounding in the first step. So let's say once again you're asked to find 3% of 13% of 2.9. So you start by finding 13% of 2.9, and once again you find that it's 0.377. But this time you decide to round that up to the nearest tenth, and you decide to round it to 0.4. So when you go on to your next step, finding 3% of your result from step 1, 3% of 0.4 is 0.012. That's already rounded to the nearest thousandth, and your answer would be 0.012. So notice that these two answers are different, even though you might have done the calculations correctly. By rounding in this second example, it threw off your answer, and your final answer was off by 1/1000th. That will still be marked wrong, especially in a checkpoint, a workbook, a unit exam, a final exam. If you're off by 1,000th, you are wrong. So just remember, anytime you're doing a multi-step equation or a multi-step process, do not round your answer until you get to the final step, and then round only according to how the problem has asked you to round. Formatting. Pay attention to your formatting. For the most part in this class, since this is a business math class, you're going to be asked to put things in a currency format, which looks like this. So notice that, and remember currency meaning money, okay? So anytime your answer is in some sort of dollar and cents amount. I have a dollar sign. I have my decimal point, and I have rounded to the nearest cent. One big thing that I recommend including is this comma if it's appropriate. Okay, so if you have a number, 10,000, you would include the comma. 100,000, you would include the comma. 1 million, you'd have 2 commas, etc. If commas are appropriate, please include them. This is just one of the particulars of how the class wants you to format. I don't have control over that, and I know it can be a little frustrating to have that really exact formatting, but that's why I'm telling you this now. So, for example, say the answer was 2,000, and you typed in 2,000, but the answer came back and told you it was wrong. Here's some ways that might happen. If you had typed in any of these answers, although $2,000 is correct, formatting might make the question be marked incorrect. So for example, if you had written 2,000, let's look at this first one, 2,000, notice there's no comma, there's no decimal with the cents behind it. In this example, again, notice there's no decimal with the cents behind it. So even though it's 2,000 even, we still need to be exact and say that it's $2,000 and 0 cents. And then in this last one, notice that there's no dollar sign. So again, the components that we want to be extra careful about including when appropriate, when we're talking about currency, our dollar sign, our comma if it's appropriate, and then our cents, again, if it's appropriate. Now, there might be a time where it tells you to round a specific way, like round to the nearest dollar, round a different way. If so, prioritize the directions over what I'm telling you here. I'm just saying for the standard question, this is the formatting that you want to adhere to. So, continuing on that, say that this was the answer you came up with. 188,998.69554. So you have this final answer and you're asking yourself, well, what should I type in as my answer? Depending on how the question has asked you to format, there are different things you might need to type in to be answered correctly. So for example, let's say it asks you to put your answer to the nearest cent. That would be 188,000. Notice I have my dollar sign, comma, 998 point. I'm going to look at the 5. The 5 is telling me to round up to 70 cents. So this would be my answer to the nearest cent. Now let's look at the nearest dollar. So once again, I start with my dollar sign, 188, comma, 0.99. I have to figure out if I'm going to round up to 999 or down to 998. Let's see. It's this 6 is indicating to me that I'm going to end up rounding up to 999. Now for the most part, if it tells you to round to the nearest dollar, you don't need to include cents. So I could leave this answer as 188,999. Next, to the nearest thousand, let's do this. Okay, so where's my thousands place? It's right here, so I have to figure out if this is going to be 188,000 or 189,000. So notice that it's $998. That means I'll be rounding up. My answer will be 189,000. I've rounded to the nearest thousandth. And again, since they said the nearest thousand, I don't have to strictly include cents here. And then let's look at one last example. Here they say the nearest 10,000. Where's the 10,000s place? It's right here. So I have to figure out, am I rounding down to 180,000 or up to 190,000? Well, look at the number behind it. This indicates that we're going to be rounding up to 190,000. Okay, so notice that using the same number, depending on how it asks you to round, I've come up with 4 different ways that I could type in my answer. But in each of them, because we're talking about money, I still included my dollar sign and my comma where it was appropriate. Again, the question will be specific about how it wants you to round, so just pay attention. It usually will indicate that in the very last section or last sentence of the problem. One more thing, rates. Rates describe a ratio. And for the most part in this class, rates will come about written as decimals or percentages. When you're asking or when you're answering a question, it might ask you for a percentage or it might ask you for a decimal. You might feel that these are roughly the same thing. For example, we know that 0.9 is the same thing as saying 9%. But the question might not accept both of these as a correct answer, so just be careful about whether it explicitly wants you to answer in percentage form, which would be 9%, or in decimal form, which would be 0.09. And just in case you're a little bit rusty on converting from percentages to decimals and back, remember that in order to convert percent to decimal, we're dividing the percent by 100. Okay? Percentage is really just a symbol that's telling us, for example, here we're talking about 78%. That percent is really just telling us out of 100. So 78% means 78 out of 100, right? So to get decimal form, we divide 78 by 100. For example, if you look here, 78 divided by 100, 0.78. Okay, and you can also look at it as moving the decimal point 2 places to the left, if that's a handy way for you to visualize it. So here's what this looks like. So 1 place, 2 places. Now, going back is the opposite. If you're in decimal form and you want to go to percentage, you would multiply by 100, right? Remember, again, think of the percentage as saying out of 100. So if I have 0.78, that's like saying 78 out of 100.